On Friday, author Salman Rushdie was attacked at a speaking event in New York by a man who stormed the stage and stabbed Rushdie in the neck. Reports say a 24-year-old New Jersey man stabbed Rushdie 10 times. The 75-year-old author was airlifted to a hospital following the attack and is now on the road to recovery. And though he's headed in the right direction, his agent says he could lose an eye in the recovery process. Iran denied any link with the attacker, but blamed Rushdie for, quote, insulting Islam in the novel The Satanic Verses. Iran said, quote, in this attack, we do not consider anyone other than Salman Rushdie and his supporters worthy of blame and even condemnation. Just disgusting.
Terrible. Joining us now to weigh in is associate editor at Reason Magazine, Liz Wolfe. Liz, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. So, this was always something that could happen. Salman Rushdie has been under fatwa for insulting Islam. His book, The Satanic Verses, I don't even know how many years ago that was now. It was in the 90s. It was prior to that. I don't remember. It's been forever. He has been under threat of attack. It's been 30 years. Our producers are telling us, so about right. This could always happen, and it just did. He got attacked, and I had to note all the. I'm just seeing on Twitter all the kind of news headlines being like, well, there's no motive yet in the attack. We don't know. I think we know. Do we know, Liz? Do we maybe have any kind of inclination on why this happened?
Yeah, I think we saw this in a lot of the New York Times coverage of this case. A lot of stuff about how we don't know the motive. I mean, look, in 1989, a fatwa was placed by Ayatollah Khomeini on Rushdie's head. That's a bounty of $2.5 million that in subsequent years was actually upped to a higher dollar amount. Although Rushdie was initially placed under police protection in the UK and was able to stay safe, many of the people involved in the book's publication were not so lucky. So a Japanese translator of the book was brutally killed in the years that followed, I believe in 1991. An Italian translator was stabbed and thankfully did not succumb to his injuries. And then a Turkish translator was attacked by an arsonist while praying. And although he survived, 37 people who he was praying with did not survive. This fatwa has already had a really staggering, astonishing death toll. And I think it's a little bit dense and absurd for us to pretend that this is in some way disconnected from that, when Rushdie is somebody who, because of his depiction of Islam in a book about magical realism, where a schizophrenic character is basically envisioning this like funhouse mirror alternative, portrayal, creation story of Islam, it was considered blasphemous by the Iranian government, and the book was actually banned by tons of other governments, like the Indian government. But for us to pretend like this controversial history of this novel is in some way disconnected from the Rushdie attack is crazy.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'm not one to compare between things like, the government of Iran putting a literal fatwa on someone and cancel culture in America. I always sort of try to keep those things apart because, one is very, very violent and the other is sort of, in its insistence that, language is violent, is less sort of physically violent. However, there is one thing that I think is really important to point out. Can either of you imagine the Satanic Verses being published today in the climate that is right now happening in the book publishing world, the terror of woke mobs? Nothing gets published that could even potentially offend anybody, right? And to me, that is such a horrible thing I cannot imagine that book getting published today, getting greenlit today. Can you just imagine the outrage on Twitter by the supposed left, right? That was once the vanguard of free speech. So to me, there is a sort of continuum here to where we are making fatwas like that. Iran doesn't even need to issue them anymore because we're doing their dirty work here by censoring our writers. Does that make sense?
I think that's an interesting point. It's difficult for me to fully assess that, but I would point to the rise of sensitivity readers, for example. This really bizarre phenomenon where so many publishing houses will now employ somebody to read a fiction book where maybe an author is depicting the experiences of a tattooed woman living in Brooklyn, the experiences of somebody like me. So they would employ Liz Wolfe to give this book a read to see whether it's appropriately sensitive and true to my experience. But like, this is a thing that, Kat Rosenfield has documented for Reason pretty extensively in a recent feature. It's a really disturbing phenomenon. And although these publishing houses are well within their rights to decide how they want to do quality control for the books that they're publishing, it's concerning for them to be so obsessed, almost obsessed with this idea that the book has to either be by an author who has a certain experience in order to depict a certain type of situation, or that it has to go through rounds and rounds of sensitivity readers for edits, honestly, to ensure that it's maximally woke in many cases.
Well, J.K. Rowling has commented on this matter, saying, quote, "Feeling very sick right now, let him be okay." To which one Twitter user wrote, "Don't worry, you are next." J.K. Rowling then asked Twitter for support on the issue, let her fans know that she did get the police involved. Obviously someone who's faced just unrelentingly harsh criticism for the comments she's made, the kind of stance she's taken on women's issues, on transgender issues. And I really agree with you, Batya. We don't want to draw a false equivalency here. Cancel culture is not remotely the same thing as people being physically, violently attacked because of the fatwa, that kind of thing. And also they've been after Rushdie, the sort of Islamic extremist threat to Rushdie's life has been a factor for so long. It predates the kind of modern, recent cancel culture sensitivity kind of regime. And I think that's really important to note. But I do take your point, and we do have to point out how free speech is no longer a sacrosanct principle on the left among progressives. It is something that many progressive writers, thinkers, commentators, activists on college campuses, etc., talk about as now a right-wing value, as something they don't practice because free speech allows for harm. I tweeted some survey I saw, and you've seen so many of these surveys of the number of college students or liberal young people, progressive young people who will say that it is in some cases permissible to fight offensive speech with violence or with physical force. So we can't, I think we shouldn't ignore those trends, and we should be worried about those trends, even if we want to be clear that we're talking about a different thing that does absolutely predate that and is much worse, a much more obvious, stark, appalling example of violence, and not one coming from oversensitive liberals, but from Islamic extremism, which has been this long-running threat to free speech and et cetera.
Well, there are interesting edge cases in the realm of cancel culture where you see college students embracing this idea that words equal violence. And I think one of the most prominent examples that we saw of this was in 2017 when Charles Murray was attacked on Middlebury College's campus. Charles Murray is obviously a very controversial writer and researcher who has long been fascinated by class differences and class stratification in America. And he's done a lot of interesting research attempting to link IQ and intelligence differences to class, and then also possible racial correlations in IQ differences. He's a very controversial thinker and writer, but at Middlebury, a bunch of students invited him to come speak. A leftist professor was invited to come do a dialogue with him afterward to basically push back on his comments. And the students, via heckling and then later attacking, shouted them down. And then as they attempted to get to safety, because things were really turning violent, the leftist professor who was shielding Murray ended up being attacked and having to go to the hospital to get a neck brace. Obviously, it could have been much worse, and that's not nearly on the same level as being stabbed or the terrible arson attack on one of Rushdie's translators many years ago. But let's be very clear. These are leftist American students in, I think, the Northeast, who just a few years ago perceived this as within the Overton window of an acceptable reaction to Murray's words, which these were words that also were going to be critically engaged with, and they deprived themselves of the chance to hear that, and in the process of doing so, turned to violence. To me, this is a really startling, disturbing phenomenon, and it's very important to draw differences between a fatwa being issued and the actions, which are thankfully still somewhat limited, of these crazy leftists on campus. But all of these trends are really disturbing because free speech always and everywhere ought to be protected.
I totally agree with you. And I actually happen to think that The Bell Curve is a very racist book. And I still think everything you said is true. It was like completely unacceptable how they behaved. The way to fight bad ideas is with, better ideas and more speech. 100% on board with that.
And that's exactly what they were trying to do. Like, what could be more valuable than having a leftist professor engaging in that
Totally.
pushback?
Right,
100%.
and they put her in a neck brace.
Yeah.
They literally, that was an example of literal physical violence from intolerant students. A really stark example of that kind of thing. Liz, thank you so much for joining us this morning. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll be back with more Rising right after this. And of course, we wish Salman Rushdie full recovery. Want to hear more from him. So much more brilliance he has to share with us. So speedy recovery to him, of course.
Amen.